This is Nan McKay, and I would like to introduce you today to Lisa Walker. Lisa has been the CEO and General Counsel of the Housing and Development Law Institute, a national nonpartisan legal think tank and training organization in both the public and the affordable housing industry based in Washington, D.C. And she's been there for 18 years. Lisa's responsible for all affairs of the organization, including authoring HDLI's amicus briefs before the U.S. Supreme Court and other courts of appeal, of course, across the country, authoring HDLI's periodicals and publications, and providing one-on-one member support on a myriad of legal and operational issues. She was a partner and commercial litigator at Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, LLP, which is a large regional law firm servicing the Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia corridor. For 6 years, she was part of the team that represented the city of Baltimore and the Housing Authority of Baltimore City in Thompson versus HUD, a class action suit that spurred major public housing reform in Baltimore City and throughout the region. Lisa is licensed to practice law before the United States Supreme Court, among many others. She serves as a local election judge and has been active in local and national bar associations, on nonprofit board of directors, as well, of course, as a number of other service and civic organizations. And here's an interesting tidbit. She serves as a pro bono general counsel to the Miss Black USA Pageant and Scholarship Foundation, which is very unusual. So welcome, Lisa Walker.
Thank you, Nan. I'm happy to be here.
Now, Lisa, you're a fellow of the Academy of Housing and Communities, which means that you were selected as one of the men and women who have forged public policy and the direction of housing and communities. So tell us a little more about the role that you play in this arena.
Well, I currently, as you know, I'm CEO and General Counsel of the Housing and Development Law Institute, HDLI. And HDLI is one of several industry groups in the public and affordable housing industry. But HDLI is a little unique in that we focus on the legal aspects of the industry. And our mission is to keep housing professionals and the attorneys that represent housing agencies and developers, keep them up to date on current legislation, on regulations and legal decisions across the country that will affect the industry. So we're sort of the lawyers to the lawyers in the public and affordable housing industry, and as well as, of course, an advocate for housing agencies from a legal perspective.
Well, most people might not realize how important that is, but it is huge because you're talking about a big industry because you're both on the private and public side. And there's so much legislation and regulations that get published constantly that it's great that you're providing a service where people can go and be kept up to date. So what intrigued you about the organization enough to join it in the first place?
Well, you know, I come from a litigation background. So I was a commercial litigator representing disputes or representing companies in their business disputes, and found a niche in my private practice working with the city of Baltimore and with the Baltimore Housing Authority, and really started to develop an interest in fair housing law. And when I found that there was an opportunity at HDLI to really narrow my focus from being a general commercial litigator to really specializing in an industry that I thought was critically important to real people and to the lives of people every day, I really jumped at the opportunity to really narrow my scope and to focus in that area that I really had come to love so much. So I actually got a call one day. I was at Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston I was a partner in the commercial litigation group there. And my responsibilities at that time in the early 90s was to oversee what we called in that litigation, the local defendants, their implementation of a huge consent decree that really revolutionized the low and moderate housing, low income and moderate income housing that was available in the city of Baltimore. And my job was to make sure that the city of Baltimore and that the Baltimore Housing Authority complied with innumerable obligations under that consent decree. And I did that for 6 years. Can you believe I was on one case for 6 years? Of course, I had all kinds of other responsibilities. I might be doing employment law disputes one day, product liability litigation another day. It could have been all kinds of things. So when I had the opportunity, because one of the former housing commissioners who had since left the city gave me a call one day and said, you know, there's this organization in Washington that does a lot of critical housing work. And having worked with you, I think you'd be perfect to work as their new general counsel. And I didn't realize at that point that it was also going to be a CEO opportunity as well. But he said, you know, I think you should look into it. And their general counsel is leaving, and you know, it might be a good opportunity. So that's really how I got involved with HDLI. And now 18 years later, I haven't even looked back.
I'm curious, was the consent decree on the waiting list?
It involved the waiting list. It involved the demolition of 5 mass public housing developments that were really warehouses for the poor. The demolition and reconstruction of those 5 public housing developments into mixed income, mixed use, lower density housing environments. It involved creating a novel home ownership program for low and affordable housing. It also created a mobility program that had not existed before then for Section 8 participants to really have more housing opportunities outside of these inner city environments that had very low opportunities for them in terms of jobs and good school systems. So we created brand new programs, demolished and redeveloped those housing units that were there before. And it was quite an undertaking. And my job was to make sure that the local defendants, the city and the housing authority, understood their obligations and followed through with them.
So were you working with Hope 6?
Hope 6 was the big player in the game at that point for redevelopment. It since has sort of phased out. There's no more Hope 6. But yes, Hope 6 was the funding mechanism that drove all the redevelopment projects.
And when you talk about a mobility program, I assume, and you're talking about the voucher program, I assume that it was the ability to be able to get more people into the suburban areas or into non-impacted neighborhoods, or what did it involve?
Absolutely, yes. It involved educating people who had primarily grown up in the city, maybe for generations, their family lived in the city and that's all they knew, that's where they were comfortable, educating them and helping them to understand the options that were available either in other parts of the city that perhaps they weren't familiar with, or outside the city in the surrounding counties, and really encouraging them and providing them support so that they can move out and be successful in those more areas of higher opportunity.
What did you find? I'm just curious on this as well. Did you find, for instance, that people were a little reticent to go to a different area, probably because of childcare and not knowing the area? Were there some convincing to do in those areas?
That's a great question, because there was a lot of hand-holding. Think about the prospect of moving to an area where you have no support systems. You're moving to an area that in many cases, you were not going to be well received initially. because NIMBYism existed then, not in my backyard mentality, and it exists today, unfortunately. But back then, a big part of the program was to really support and encourage people to take that leap with themselves and with their families, their children, go to areas where they weren't familiar and really set down roots and be able to grow and flourish. So it was a big selling job, and the Baltimore Housing Authority did a wonderful job of really setting up that support system. And then there had to be education in the communities as well. You know, the surrounding areas, the residents of those communities, they had to feel comfortable that people who were coming there through our program were going to have that support in place, had the training available to them, and so that they could be successful there. I remember one story, and it was sort of emblematic of what the real political climate was back then. Now, remember, this is early 90s. This is during the war on drugs. President Clinton was in office. And I remember we would have neighborhood charrettes. And charrette is really just a fancy name for a meeting among all the stakeholders in the community. So you had the clergy there, you had leaders in the government, you had the school system representatives there, you had advocates there, and of course you had residents who lived in the communities attend these. And we would come as, you know, the attorneys just there as support for our clients while they put on these charrettes, along with their architects and developers who were going to really talk about either redevelopment opportunities or if it was the mobility program, really encouraging the communities to be open-minded. And I remember at one of these charrettes, we walked in and there was police support at this particular one. And we literally had to be escorted out of the meeting by police because the residents in that community were so opposed and so, you know, really just against the idea of inner city, mostly minority people coming out into their, at that time, mostly Caucasian neighborhood. And it was a very scary, you know, it reminds me today of what recently happened at the nation's capital when the Proud Boys and other groups stormed the Capitol. It was a similar type of feeling back in those days. And it was an interesting experience, but one that I would never want to repeat.
So what was the end result of that? Did you just kind of back off of that area?
No. In fact, you know, there's always a balancing between where is the best place to place new housing, what are all the competing interests, but one interest that cannot be taken into account and really serve as a basis for making a decision not to develop or not to bring a program is because there's opposition from the community. It is a violation of your obligation as a housing provider if you accede to the whims of the community when they are evidencing racism or NIMBYism or you know, outright objections that are not founded on any really valid principles and really are just embedded in an overall feeling of you know, racist intent. So no, we didn't back away. The city didn't back away. They kept pledging, you know, to continue the project, and those projects were successful ultimately. But I have to say, you know, on balance, the truth of the matter is very few families took part and availed themselves of these opportunities and these programs for the reasons, Nan, that you mentioned earlier. They're not comfortable moving. Many of the families that did participate and eventually through mobility vouchers moved away, ended up coming back to the very same communities where they knew and were comfortable and lived previously. So that's a challenge that is ongoing, making, you know, housing communities of choice in all areas so that people who are making decisions don't have to worry about their race being a factor in where they should live or where they would be comfortable or where they should raise their children. So it's an ongoing problem and one that many resources need to be devoted to. And I'm so encouraged by the new administration, the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration coming in. I have to put in a plug here, shameless plug, but Kamala Harris is my sorority sister. So I'm very, very thrilled with her leadership and that of President Biden already out of the box in the area of erasing vestiges of discrimination and really focusing HUD on it being a primary mission to revisit its non-discrimination policy. So I'm excited about that.
Well, and HUD does need to revisit some of that. And part of it is money, and part of it is the attention to it, making it a priority. I interviewed Brian Green, and he was Fair Housing Director for a long time. And I also interviewed Larry Pearl, who was director prior to that. And he talked a lot about testing and the difference in the neighborhoods as it related to appraisals and a lot of things like that. And he's now working for the National Association of Realtors. So he's still interested in housing, but he said back then, what they did was effective, but it was so small, narrow in what they could get done with the priority and the money that they had available to do things. So it has to be made a priority so that the money and everything else trickles down that direction.
Absolutely.
Speaking of direction, what direction have you steered HDLI in since becoming CEO? Have you made some changes when you first came in, or has it evolved over time?
Well, yeah. I came into an organization that was founded back in 1984. So it's been in business for almost 2 decades when I came on board. And so it was firmly grounded in the industry. But one of the things that I knew was that I needed to help to brand the organization a little more clearly. I think a lot of people associated us with another of the larger industry groups that actually was instrumental in getting HDLI started back in 1984. And they thought we were sort of a part of that organization. So really starting to rebrand HDLI, helping to become more of a legal advocate for public housing agencies was a big priority. We do that in a number of ways, most particularly by serving as a friend of the court in various important litigation that's important to the industry and is going to affect agencies and housing programs nationwide. So we file briefs in the US Supreme Court and other courts of appeal across the country when we think that it'll be important to state the industry's perspective in that particular litigation. So we've filed many amicus briefs on behalf of our members and on behalf of industry members to really try to mold those decisions that interpret the laws and regulations. So we put an emphasis on really doing more of that, legal advocacy. I wanted to create more model policies that industry members could use so that there's consistency and so that people have an understanding of how the policies that they write will affect their abilities to really carry out their programs and being able to defend the policies that they write because they're in conformity with court decisions and the laws. So we focused on providing more model policies. I really also wanted to work more closely with our sister industry groups and collaborate more so. They work very well together because the other industry groups are more focused on the lobbying efforts and really working more on day-to-day operations. And as a legally focused group, we don't do so much of that. So I really wanted to find ways where we could work together with those groups and establish closer relationships. So I think I've succeeded in that. I've been very happy with the relationships that HDLI has with our sister groups, and that was another focus of mine when I first came aboard and has evolved into even branching out into even more groups. What else? Our training products, I guess. When I came on board, HDLI didn't do any formal training outside of our conferences. And we've put on legal conferences since the beginning of the organization. But what I wanted to see was even more enhanced training. So we started to do more on-site training. Nan, you are just a stalwart in the industry for on-site training and training of housing authorities and their operations. So I wanted to create a similar thing from a legal perspective and provide that same type of enhanced training on legal issues. So we've been doing fair housing training, and we've branched out into a number of other types of training, really trying to focus on legal aspects. And we customize that training, and we use their local laws and their local policies so that it's really meaningful for agencies all across the country. So I spend quite a bit of my time pre-COVID traveling across the country and doing face-to-face training. And as you and your organization probably has done during this crisis, is now we're doing virtual trainings, and it's a whole new animal. But it still allows for us to bring that much needed resource to the agencies. But I'm really looking forward to the face-to-face interaction. I really love that. And I think it's so much more meaningful. Don't you?
Oh, I definitely do. I have been doing executive management classes there, which is a 5-day class all day long over Zoom. And it really has worked out pretty well. But
yeah.
It's just very different because, you can't really go touch and feel the person, I mean, it's right. You feel like you're way back over here on the screen versus right there.
Yeah.
So it's just different, but, we have to adjust just like everybody. We have to adjust. I'm curious about something else. I've never been so curious in a whole interview as I am with you. So many fun questions to ask you. Let's talk about policy for a minute, because I feel strongly that having a good, strong policy is really important to an agency, simply because it is kind of the executive director or the board talking to the staff when they're not present or have involved in every single decision. So
that's a good way to look at it. Yes.
I do advocate for a pretty comprehensive administrative plan, which really lays out very clearly in detail the policy for agencies. Mm-hmm. Some agencies don't feel that way, and they feel that it's better to have it really loose so that if they decide to change it, or they decide to just maybe not follow it for every single person, that it gives them more flexibility. Do you have any feelings on that one way or the other? Because I guess there's pros and cons on the whole thing.
And I see both sides of the equation, but I have to agree with you, Nan. I am a proponent of a very comprehensive policy. But I want to make sure we're careful of the terms that we're using, though, because there's a distinction, and I think it's pretty important in the public world, between a policy and a procedure, right? So the policy itself can be and should be somewhat flexible and non-specific. It should get right to the point of what the policy is aimed at approaching, but it should not have so much detail so that if there needs to be adjustments in the future, that it has to go through a rigorous vetting process that policies in the public world have to go through. So when public agencies formulate policy, at least in public housing authorities, it has to be vetted and blessed by those that the policies will affect. So in our world, the public housing residents, Section 8 participants, and their advocates. And then it also has to be blessed by the Board of Commissioners that is overseeing the entire agency. So they have to pass resolutions adopting those policies. So anytime you make a change, you've got to go back to all those parties and re-vet the process. So to that extent, it's not a good idea to have policies that are so specific that when you want to change procedural types of things because you think something might work better a different way, you don't want to have to go back and go through the vetting process. So I believe in having very robust procedures that do lay out specifically. And I like your analogy of having the executive speaking through the policies, because it is providing that guidance and it's providing the consistency that staff is going to need to be able to handle different situations. And I think that that's where you really do want to have the meaty documents. That's in your specific procedures.
Oh, I so agree with you. And you're right. And I'm glad you made that distinction, because there is such a difference between policy and procedure. Policy is more the what, and procedure is more the how. And so many people don't have procedures, or they're way out of date.
Yes.
I keep telling them, if you have a clear procedure on how to do it, what step 1, step 2, step 3, you're going to have a couple of things. One is you're going to have somebody that's brand new that comes in that can follow it because they'll see exactly what to do. And then 2 is it's part of your leadership systems. And so if you you have to keep those up, so that if the executive director, let's say, leaves and a new executive director comes in, it's not like, well, what were you doing after all? It's right there.
Right. Yeah, there shouldn't be any guesses. It should all be straightforward and in layperson's terms so that everyone can understand it. Haven't you seen those policies that obviously were written by either a lawyer or someone with legal training, and you have to read them 3 times before you can understand what they really mean?
Yeah, it's like, what was that?
Yeah, those are the worst.
When we were talking about the Thompson versus the HUD case. Was that part of the mobility case? Was that the mobility case, or was that something else?
Yes, mobility was first established in Thompson versus HUD in the Baltimore region.
Okay. Now, another thing that I'd like to know is, I have been a huge proponent, I guess, all my life. I think when I was about 38, you almost could have called me militant. I guess I'm not as much anymore. This is a lot of years later. But a big thing today is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I just so believe in that, and grew up in the era where that wasn't really a part of anything. And I wonder whether that is playing a role for you today in the legal environment that you're working in.
Let me think about that. The law is supposed to be blind, right? So it shouldn't necessarily matter who is in charge of interpreting the law, or even in charge of creating the law. It should be written in a way that is colorblind and blind in every other way. But we also know that clearly our history shows from, the beginning of the founding of this country, that laws have been written by elite people for the benefit of elite people. And even the laws that address disparities in communities, like fair housing laws, like housing laws for affordable housing. And we know that sometimes the people who are writing those laws are disaffected from the implementation of those laws and may not be able to fully understand the impact of what they're writing. So a lot of times, unfortunately, we get legislation and we get regulations that are just not workable in our communities, that, in low and moderately low income communities. So unfortunately, I think there is a role to be addressed in terms of who is writing and who's interpreting these laws, because again, the people that are supposed to benefit from low and public housing, low income and public housing programs are really not necessarily the people who usually are in charge of creating those laws. So there's a disconnect sometimes. And so I think that there could be more of a role for people who are impacted by these programs to take part in the development of the programs and of the laws and the rules that support those programs. With public housing, there is a rule that if you are a public housing organization, you are not just strictly administering a Section 8 program, but you are also administering, bricks and mortar public housing units. You have to have a resident who serves on the Board of Commissioners that oversees that organization, so that someone with that perspective is in charge of implementing policy at that level. So why not have that same structure on the federal level or on the state level, outside of just the local level with housing authorities? So I think it would be a great idea to expand that concept of inclusion and diversity so that the programs are more reflective of what the needs are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When you think back, what would you consider your biggest success story?
Well, I think before HDLI, clearly my biggest success was Thompson versus HUD and the role I played in really transforming and reforming the whole public housing program, not just in Baltimore, but throughout the region, because Baltimore, that housing authority is the largest and its program is the largest in the region. And Baltimore had really been the dumping ground for the poorest of poor in our region. So, going from Baltimore south all the way down to the borders of Washington, D.C. and Virginia, all of the poor people were sort of shipped up to Baltimore. And that's because housing programs were, back in the creation of the program, specifically geared towards doing that. And so Baltimore had a disproportionate share of the poor and disproportionate share of the obligation to house the poor. And so this program that, all of the programs that were created as a result of that litigation, I think made a drastic difference for the whole region. And so I admire the plaintiffs who brought the lawsuit, the ACLU who supported the plaintiffs in that litigation. They were the lead counsel there. Then there was Jenner and Block. They were outside counsel during the years that I was there, and they probably had other big law firms that came in to assist the plaintiffs in that case. In addition to the local defendants, the city defendants, and the housing authority, HUD was a defendant in that case. So HUD was represented by HUD counsel, as well as attorneys from the Justice Department. So we had, in any particular meeting, it was not unusual to have 8, 10, 12 lawyers representing all the various different interests. And it was a great learning opportunity for me as a young lawyer. Back then I was in my 20s. And, I believe that was probably my biggest success before I came to HDLI. And I guess since I've been at HDLI, as I mentioned earlier, really expanding the programming that we did, the advocacy that we did. And then, more recently, in the last maybe 5 years or so, really being able to respond to the fiscal challenges that we had, as the market entered a very dark period, so did housing programs. And so therefore, so did agencies that support those programs. So really being able to navigate HDLI through that really dark financial and fiscal period, I consider that a major success as well. We're a small organization and we rely on almost primarily on the support of housing agencies and developers and management companies in this industry. So when things affect them, it affects us too. Well, but I think, Nan, my largest, clearly, success has been raising my two children.
Hmm.
That's really the biggest and the best thing I've done.
Do you find more, of course, your kids are grown now, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, they're in their 20s. One's 23 and the other's 21.
Yeah, they don't really consider themselves totally necessarily grown.
They consider themselves grown. I'm not sure I consider them grown.
So let's go back to the HDLI and talk about challenges. What are some of the biggest challenges that you faced?
Well, because we're a small organization, we always have the challenge of taking on too much, wanting to take on more in terms of programming or partnerships and things like that. So that's a major challenge. We can't do as much as we would like to do with the small staff that we have. So that's always a challenge. And then really trying to prioritize among the many things that we could be addressing for the industry, what we think are the most important things. So we do that in our programs. When we have conferences, we always try to focus on the hottest issues that are facing the industry. And in our training, we try to make sure they're current to address those types of issues. But it's kind of a challenge, I think, also to make sure that you're giving the right type of emphasis to what's most important. So staying in tune with the agencies that we are trying to serve, making sure that we're giving them a voice is something that we try to do so that we can really make sure we're relevant.
What do you think is the future of affordable housing?
Well, I think the future of affordable housing is grim. I don't want to pull any punches. It's a dying industry from the perspective of the support that we're getting from Congress, who funds the programs, from the executives who are running the government. There has been less and less priorities to low and low income programs, and the future does not look good for there being a resurgence of that from a funding perspective. Again, I'm very hopeful and optimistic that our president will make sure that there is equity restored and that there will be more attention given to these programs and less to other programs that the federal government funds. But I think that's one of the major challenges is the funding. There are backlogs in the multi-millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of capital programs and capital needs that these agencies are struggling with. They've got dilapidated housing that they're trying to keep going so that they can house people. So I think one of the major struggles will be to create incentives for there to be a public-private partnership. Right now we have basically tax credits and opportunity zones to incentivize that type of partnership. But we've got to be creative and create more opportunities for private industry to come in and take an interest in providing public and affordable housing. And, finding that type of creativity outside of the programs that already exist is, what we kind of elect our legislators to do. So I'm hoping there'll be more of that private and public partnership. And I'd really like to see, in terms of a legislative priority, more emphasis on funding self-sufficiency programs for individuals and getting them the tools and resources they need so that they can have a livable wage and they can earn enough money to get themselves up and out of public assistance programs. It's all been bantered about. There are regulations on the books that require community service and things like that, but we really need a meaty program backed up with real financial resources, not just unfunded mandates, to really bring real self-sufficiency programs into life. And, you know, I don't see why a country that is as blessed and as profitable and as brilliant as the United States can't come up with a program or series of programs that will give people the opportunity to really have a real fighting chance at a good life for themselves outside of public programs. And I think we're smart enough to do that. It just takes the political will to make it happen.
Well, when we went from family self-sufficiency as a mandatory commitment when you had new allocations of units, and to now being totally voluntary, really, that made a difference, because then people said, well, I don't know if I really want to do this, or it just wasn't available that much. So maybe we need that mandate again.
Yeah. I don't think we can always rely on the good faith of people who are developing housing or running housing, managing housing. I think you're right. I think there needs to be more of a mandate. And also, you know, not just a carrot, but a stick in the event that they decide that they're not going to do what they really should do. Because at the end of the day, Nan, making people better equipped to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, which is what, you know, we hear that mantra that people should be doing all the time, but giving them the opportunities to actually do it benefits the whole community. It benefits us all.
Absolutely, it does. And it makes such a better life for everyone. You know, if you can just people, and the FSS program is so good in the sense that, you know, it puts a proportion away into escrow. I mean, there's so many positive things about it.
Yeah.
I've got to ask you this one. When you said you were general counsel to the Miss Black USA Pageant and Scholarship Foundation, oh, how much fun! Tell me a little bit about that. What were some of the events you attended? What are some of the challenges you faced? Oh my gosh, you know, my hair doesn't look right, or what did you do with it?
You look beautiful, Dad. Well, you know, it is such a pleasure. And it's an honor, really, to be part of this organization. And I do want to tell you about it because it's phenomenal. You know, when you hear the Miss Black USA pageant, you think, oh, it's just another beauty pageant. You know, you've got a bunch of women parading around, you know, trying to look beautiful. And the queen and the winner is going to be the most beautiful. Well, this pageant is a lot different than your usual beauty pageant. It was founded by a woman, a visionary named Karen Arrington. And Karen used to compete. This was back in the early 80s as well. She used to compete when she was a little girl in pageants. And she just found them to be such a wonderful way for her to create more confidence and to get scholarship money and things like that. Well, when she looked around, she found that she might be one or maybe one of very few African Americans participating in those pageants. They were founded by primarily Caucasians for Caucasians. So you saw back in the 80s, now you remember, we're thinking 30 years ago, you know, or more, pageants where there just wasn't a lot of representation. And she knew how rich the African American community was and how much talent there was. And so she said to her dad one day, who at that time, I believe, or maybe previously to that, had been mayor of where she grew up. And she said, Dad, you know, we just don't see a lot of African American pageants. In fact, I don't know of any. And I just think it's such a disservice because it's so hard for African American women to get into these pageants. We're missing an opportunity to really, you know, see all this great opportunity and talent. And he said, well, if you don't see it, why don't you start your own? And that's exactly what she did. And for over 25 years, she has been running this pageant, and she's been It's just a fabulous opportunity instead of it being focused on beauty. And not to, discount the beauty of the women who participate. They are all beautiful, but they're also talented. I mean, these women, all of them are either in college or have recently graduated college or in some type of professional school. So the queens of these pageants have been medical doctors and engineers and ballerinas. And I mean, the talent that they showcase during the talent portion. The woman who won the last pageant, her talent was she sang opera in Italian, a whole opera. And, it's just amazing. And so she started this organization. I actually became involved just about a decade ago and really just wanted to support her and help her to work on documents for the pageant, and gave her advice when she was making deals and things like that. And it sort of evolved to me becoming the general counsel. So I've been doing that for about 10 years. And Karen has been able to launch this pageant. She took them to the Gambia in West Africa and held a pageant there. All expenses paid for all the participants. I mean, she is incredible. She is just incredible. In fact, she's gone on more recently to win an NAACP Image Award for the first book that she wrote, focusing on principles to live your best life. And so she's just been an enormous influence on so many girls and women, and on me as well.
I think sometimes it's those things you get involved with on the side, in a sense, not necessarily part of your job, that maybe bring the most joy and pleasure to you in the long run.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
With everything that we're facing now, you could say, well, we got COVID, we got the economy, we got race relations, we've got climate change, and those are all major things, each individual thing. But have you changed your outlook on really what's most important today?
Yes. You know what it has done for me, Nan? Has made me understand the importance of balance in your life and setting priorities and resetting priorities as circumstances in your life change, and not focusing so much on being the best you can be in your professional life to the sacrifice of your sanity and your happiness. And as I see people around me getting sick from COVID, passing away from COVID, there seems to be so many more people who are facing cancer. I don't think there's any surprise that it's a environmental issue as much as a health issue or a heredity issue these days. Really setting those priorities and, doing good in the world and doing it well is as important to me now, given really how precarious things are, than it ever has been.
So, knowing you have two of them, what advice do you have for those 20-somethings today?
20-somethings. Well, it's funny because when I look back on the advice I got as a 20-something, it's probably the same advice as what I received. It hasn't changed a whole lot. Maybe just a little bit of nuancing, but first of all, prepare yourself for life. Not just what you may think is your interest in life from a professional standpoint now, but prepare yourself to be educated, to be healthy. Prepare yourself well, and don't skip the step of good preparation, because that will always be, it will inform your success or not, I believe. I think standing for something, deciding what it is that's important to you in your life view, and standing strong. And, I think that builds a lot of character and helps you to at an early age, decide where you're going to prioritize. And, sometimes that gets lost in reality because your life, your professional life is going to have demands on you, and you have to be able to prioritize those demands along with the other things that are important, like your health and like spending time with your family and developing interests and hobbies and things like that. So I want 20 somethings to have a balance in their lives that is meaningful and realistic so that they don't burn out early. And then I would also say seek mentors. Not every mentor is going to come to you naturally or organically. So seek them. Find someone who you think is doing something well in an area that you would like to do well in, and seek their assistance and their guidance. And I guarantee that most people are going to be willing to carve out time for you and to help you succeed and to help you avoid some of the snafus that they ran into in their 20s. I have the pleasure of being mentors to several young people, male and female, and it's such a rich opportunity both ways because it allows me to stay connected to what young people think is important outside of what my own kids think, and also helps me to learn. There's so much that I don't know about what's going on in the world because I'm not tapped into the things that young people are tapped into musically and from a socioeconomic perspective. And, it's good to really keep your finger on the pulse of those things. So you get a mutually beneficial relationship when you're either a mentor or a mentee.
Well, Lisa, it's been so much fun talking with you. You've done such a great job, and I thank you for all those years of trying to make all the regulatory stuff clear to everybody so that it keeps them out of trouble as best you can anyway. Thank you so much for all of your time and your efforts over the last 18 years with HDLI and then even before then. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Nan. It's been a pleasure, and I'd be happy to talk to you anytime.
Great.